Romance often kicks off with grand gestures, a stolen kiss in the pouring rain, a desperate sprint to a departing train. This particular romance kicked off with a debate over a very stubborn goat. I mean, a literal goat, named Barnaby. He belonged to Clara Vance, and he possessed a nasty habit of wandering past the property line straight into Elias Torn's boatyard. Elias felt strongly that a goat with such a profound interest in shipbuilding ought to be put to work or heavily fined. Clara strongly disagreed. Leaning over the weathered picket fence, she delivered her counter-argument with the bright-eyed enthusiasm of someone who had practiced this exact speech in the mirror. Barnaby wasn't trespassing, she insisted. The property line was drawn wrong decades ago when Elias's grandfather hammered the first stakes into the dirt. If Elias cared about historical accuracy, he would happily shift his heavy boat frames 3 feet closer to the shoreline. Elias stared at her. Then he suggested that if Clara cared about the safety of her livestock, she might teach her goat how to read a "keep out" sign. Clara let out a sudden, explosive laugh. It wasn't a polite chuckle, it was a loud, genuine sound that startled the nearby gulls. Elias, who had been genuinely frustrated just moments before, felt his annoyance vanish. A totally uninvited smile crept onto his face. It was the kind of smile that warned him his quiet, predictable life was about to get complicated.
Welcome to Oakhaven, Maine, in the autumn of 1912. Elias Thorne was 34. He managed his family's boat-building business sitting on 50 acres of rocky coastline. He had a solid workshop, a house that desperately needed a fresh coat of paint on the wraparound deck, and enough steady orders to keep his bank account healthy without making him filthy rich. He had broad shoulders and hands perpetually calloused from years of shaping heavy oak. He possessed a rugged, weathered face, not classically handsome like a stage actor, but grounded and dependable. Ask anyone down by the harbor, and they would tell you Elias was the most unrelenting man in the county. He formed his opinions at a glacial pace, but once he settled on a thought, it took an act of God to change his mind. This trait made him a brilliant, meticulous shipwright. It also made him a terrible diplomat. Clara Vance was 30. She lived right next door, running a bustling apple orchard and a small apiary. Since her mother passed away a few seasons back, Clara managed the 60-acre farm entirely on her own. The harsh winters taught her a lot. She knew how to prune a diseased branch, how to haggle with stingy fruit merchants who assumed she couldn't do math, and how to handle impossibly stubborn men without ever raising her voice. That last talent came in incredibly handy whenever she dealt with Elias.
They had been neighbors for their entire lives. A crumbling stone wall separated the noisy boatyard from the quiet orchard. Their families functioned on a silent system of mutual aid that kept things running. When Elias's older brother moved out west, Clara dropped off a basket of warm bread without saying a word. When a winter gale ripped the roof off Clara's storage barn, Elias showed up with his tools and fixed the shingles before she even had to ask. The arrangement worked beautifully, right up until someone's animal decided to cross the boundary. "He's just curious," Clara noted, watching Barnaby chew thoughtfully on a coil of expensive nautical rope in Elias's yard. "He is destroying private property," Elias grumbled, crossing his arms. "He is expanding his horizons." Clara rested her chin on her hands, eyes dancing with amusement. "You could take a page from his book. He sees an artificial barrier, and he asks himself why it should stop him from finding something better. It should stop him because I will eventually turn him into a heavy winter coat." "You wouldn't dare." Clara shot him a triumphant grin, fully aware she had already won the exchange. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," she said. She hopped over the low stones, grabbed Barnaby by his leather collar with practiced ease, and hauled the stubborn goat back to the safety of the apple orchard. Elias watched her march away. He decided right then that she was the most infuriating person on the Atlantic coast. Yet he felt a strange, lingering warmth in his chest as he went back to work. The goat incident barely scratched the surface. Over the next few months, their bickering evolved into the most entertaining spectator sport in Oakhaven. It felt like a high-stakes card game where both players knew exactly what they were doing. They fought with a fiery energy that proved they were having the time of their lives. Varnaby escaped twice more. Elias reinforced the stone wall with heavy timber. Clara simply brought the goat home, casually mentioning that she respected Elias's dedication to building completely ineffective barricades. Then came the debate over the shared gravel access road leading to the main highway. They spent nearly an hour at the town hall arguing over hauling costs. They agreed on the price, but fundamentally disagreed on the principle of who should do the heavy lifting. They left the clerk scratching his head, entirely unsure if he had just witnessed a bitter feud or a bizarre courtship. A few weeks later, Elias's sheepdog dug up a massive patch of Clara's prized blackberry bushes. Clara marched over, demanding a lifetime supply of jam as compensation. Elias countered that his dog actually did her a favor by doing some much-needed aggressive pruning.
Clara gave him a look of utter disbelief that Elias had to stare at the floorboard to hide his laughter. He paid her for the damages anyway. He handed over twice the amount the bushes were actually worth because it felt like the right thing to do. Small towns process gossip faster than the Postal Service. The current rumor circulating through the local tavern was that Elias Thorne and Clara Vance were either plotting to murder each other or planning a wedding. The townsfolk split right down the middle on which outcome was more likely. Old Mrs. Higgins, the postmaster, firmly bet on romance. "I see how he stares at her when she's yelling about the property line," she told anyone buying stamps. Clara heard the whispers. She ignored them mostly because running an orchard left little time for parlor talk. But late at night, she admitted the truth to herself. She actually liked Elias. She liked him because he never patronized her. He never watered down his opinions to play nice. He respected her enough to argue with her directly. She loved his deep, rare laugh. Naturally, she planned to take these feelings to her grave. In late October, they found each other at the annual cider festival. "Clara," he greeted. "Elias, has your dog terrorized any innocent shrubs?" "He's an angel. I think he lost his touch." "Or he's waiting for the right moment to strike," she replied with absolute gravity.
"I'd keep an eye on the rigging." They stood near the edge of the pavilion floor, talking with the effortless rhythm of two people who had spent months perfecting their own private language. Mrs. Higgins caught Clara's eye from the punch bowl and wiggled her eyebrows, a gesture Clara completely ignored. A young man named Julian, a newly arrived bank clerk who hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules of Oakhaven, strode over and asked Clara for a dance. Clara glanced at Elias. Elias stared at Julian with the heavy expression of a man who suddenly realizes someone is trying to steal his favorite hammer. He caught himself and forced a tight smile. "Go right ahead," Elias said, his voice flat. "If you turn down every offer, Clara, you'll end up an old maid. Take what you can get." It was meant to sound like their usual teasing. Clara stared at him. The playful spark in her eyes vanished for a fraction of a second. Then a different kind of smile appeared, a soft, knowing look that meant she saw right through his bluff. She took half a step toward him, leaning just enough so the bank clerk couldn't hear. "Not unless you ask," she murmured. Without missing a beat, she turned to Julian with perfect politeness. "Thank you, but my feet are tired." She walked away to grab a cup of cider, leaving Elias standing exactly where he was. "Was that?" Julian started. "Go find someone else," Elias snapped. He watched Clara standing by the cider barrel, perfectly calm, her back to the room. Elias, meanwhile, was mentally repeating those 4 words while his brain tried to catch up with reality. Quick aside, if you're reading this, think about the last time a few words completely derailed your life. Let's get back to Oakhaven, because Elias is about to do some furious late-night thinking. He walked home along the rocky shoreline. He didn't take the road because he needed the biting ocean wind to clear his head. Not unless you ask. He turned the phrase over in his mind, examining it from every possible angle, applying the same grueling stubbornness he used to inspect a ship's hull. He stopped dead on the pebble beach. She had been saying it for months, not with actual words. She said it by lingering at the stone wall long after the goat had been returned. She said it by laughing at his terrible jokes when everyone else just groaned. She said it with that specific, private smile she never gave to the postmaster or the harbor master. He had treated it like a competitive sport. She had been waiting for him to wake up. The November stars over Maine were painfully bright that night. He stood there, freezing in his coat, thinking about the stolen goat, the ruined blackberries, the town hall meetings, and the sickening jolt of jealousy he felt when Julian walked over.
He finally gave that feeling a name. He had spent months avoiding it because he knew that once he admitted he loved her, he couldn't go back to the safe, predictable annoyance of being just neighbors. He sat at his kitchen table until 3 in the morning, confronting the embarrassing reality that the toughest boat builder in town was terrified of a woman who grew apples. The next morning, he formed a plan. He marched over to her orchard on a Sunday. He didn't bring flowers. Elias Thorne didn't do flowers. He brought a heavy iron wrench and a replacement gear because the crank on her cider press had been sticking since August. It gave him an excuse to be in her yard. She was untangling a fishing net from her rose bushes when he walked up. She looked at the iron gear. "The press crank," he grunted. "I know," Clara said. "I was going to fix it on Tuesday. I'm doing it now." "You don't have to." "I know." She crossed her arms, fighting a smile. He fixed the machine in 10 minutes. She brought out 2 mugs of black coffee. They sat on the wooden crates near the barn, sharing a comfortable silence. Elias put his mug on the dirt. "I thought about what she said at the dance." "Did you?" Her face gave away absolutely nothing. "I am a slow man," he said quietly.
"I want to admit that right now," Elias continued, staring at his boots. "I was remarkably slower than I should have been, considering you made it obvious." "Several months," Clara offered helpfully. "Several months," he agreed. "I could give you a dozen excuses about why I waited, but you'd see right through them, so I won't waste your breath." Clara turned to face him. Her expression was a mix of deep amusement, endless patience, and something incredibly warm. "What I am trying to say," Elias muttered, "is that I want to court you properly. Starting with dinner at my house on Thursday, if you'll come." "I will come," she said. She took a sip of her coffee. "Elias." "Yeah?" That was the least romantic declaration of affection in the history of the Eastern Seaboard. "Did it work?" "Yes," she said, her eyes crinkling, "which is probably why I sat around waiting for it." What followed was the most chaotic courtship Oakhaven had ever witnessed. It wasn't smooth. They fought for 3 days over the correct way to seal a wooden deck, a dispute that ended only when Clara's method held up better in a rainstorm. Elias conceded defeat, realizing that losing to Clara didn't actually bruise his ego at all. Between the arguments, they shared 4-hour dinners where the talking never stopped. They walked the shoreline on Sundays. They realized they agreed on everything that mattered. They disagreed on everything trivial, which Clara noted was the secret to not dying of boredom. Old Mrs. Higgins heard they were officially courting and just yelled, "Finally!" across the post office. In December, they sat on the cliff edge overlooking the gray Atlantic. Elias looked at the freezing water and said, "You know my favorite thing about you? You never let my brain turn off. You force me to care about things instead of just blindly making decisions. I didn't know my life was so quiet until you started yelling over the wall." Clara pulled her wool coat tighter. "You know my favorite thing about you? You actually listen to me. Even when we're fighting, you hear what I'm saying. That doesn't happen much." Elias proposed on her porch right before Christmas, with snow burying the orchard. He didn't plan anything fancy. Clara hated theatrics. He just looked at her and said, "I want to argue with you until we're dead. I want to fix your machines and lose about 40% of our fights." 50, she shot back. 40, he said, deadpan. Clara stared at him. "Elias Thorne, did you just try to haggle during a marriage proposal?" "I am setting a realistic baseline." She laughed, that loud, startling laugh that ruined his peace months ago. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They got married in late April. Clara wore a simple linen dress, and Elias spent the entire ceremony realizing he never wanted their conversation to stop.
Their lives merged into one massive, noisy property. The boatyard expanded. The orchard doubled in size. Clara took over the accounting for the boats, and Elias didn't even argue because her math was infinitely better than his. Their first child, a boy named Leo, arrived 2 years later. Leo inherited his father's thick skull and his mother's terrifying ability to win verbal spars. A daughter, Sarah, followed a few years after, quiet, observant, and brutally funny. Barnaby the goat somehow lived to a horrifyingly old age. When he finally died, Clara gave him a full burial near the apple trees. Elias argued that holding a funeral for a farm animal was insane. Clara argued that Barnaby was the only reason they were married. They argued about the goat's grave for years. Fast forward to the summer of 1962. The town had changed. The workshop had a new roof. Elias was 84. Clara was 80. They sat on the wraparound deck in 2 heavily repaired rocking chairs, watching the sun dip below the ocean horizon. Elias held a mug of black coffee. Clara held a cup of chamomile tea. "Coffee," he rasped, his voice rough with age, "is still the superior evening drink." "You've pushed that lie for 50 years, Clara said, not looking up from her knitting. "It's a fact." He looked at her. Her hair was stark white, her face lined with decades of salt wind and heavy laughter.
She was still the sharpest, most fascinating person he had ever met. "Clara," he said. "I was thinking about that dance when Julian asked you out. I was entirely right when I told you that you'd never get married." She stopped knitting and looked at him, her eyes still carrying that same impossible spark. "Explain," she warned. Elias smirked. "You waited until I explicitly asked, which means, technically speaking, my statement at the dance was completely accurate. You wouldn't have married anyone else." Clara set her needles down. "Elias Thorne, are you trying to win an argument about our marriage proposal 50 years after the fact?" "I am just maintaining the historical record." Clara let out that same loud, brilliant laugh. She reached across the gap between the chairs and grabbed his rough, calloused hand, exactly as she had done 10,000 times before. They sat on the deck, listening to the tide crash against the rocks. Elias and Clara never had a cinematic rescue. There was no poetry. Their life started with a trespassing goat and ruined blackberries. It survived through brutal honesty, stubbornness, and a refusal to be anything other than exactly who they were. Good banter isn't just about being funny. It's about intimacy. It's looking at someone and saying, "I know you well enough to mock you, and I trust you not to leave." They talked for 50 years. They held hands for 50 years. That is a good life.